Magnificent Delusions by Husain Haqqani, continued. In less than 2 years, Johnson's personally favourable disposition resulted in Pakistan's military approaching the American embassy with a fresh request for arms and munitions. Defence Minister Admiral Afzal Rahman Khan spoke at length on the subject with Benjamin Aylett, a former Coca-Cola executive who had arrived as ambassador in July 1967. Next to President Ayub, the Admiral told Aylett, the military establishment was America's best friend in Pakistan. The country's economic circumstances did not permit buying tanks and other much-needed equipment for the military. The army badly needed 200 new tanks, he said, so it would be a good idea if the US ambassador sat down in cool of evening over a couple of scotch and sodas with Ayub to discuss how the Americans could resume military supplies in return for retaining the Badaber base. After the war with India, Ayub had tried to obtain arms from several sources, including the Soviet Union and France, but no one seemed to be able to meet Pakistan's military needs on the type of terms on which Pakistan had become accustomed with the Americans. The Pakistanis had found that the global arms market was a tough place. No one, except the Americans, offered weapons as aid or on relatively easy financial terms. Although the United States had resumed the supply of ammunition and spare parts in April 1967, Pakistan was having difficulty buying major items like tanks and planes. For the United States, the decision was difficult. It had armed Pakistan in the past after Ayub's assurance that the Pakistan army would become theirs. But the Pakistanis had not used those weapons to fight any American enemy. Instead, they had gone to war against a friend of the United States, India. Removing the arms embargo without a change in Pakistan's policy sent the wrong message to all American allies, many of whom had their own local disputes to settle. Rusk realized the temptation to try to buy an assured future for the Peshawar facility with 100 or 200 tanks. But he also knew that linking military supply policy with Peshawar would encourage intolerable pressures from government of Pakistan for more and more hardware. Thus, the Pakistani official's request was politely turned down. When Johnson stopped over in Karachi for refueling while on his way back from a trip to Australia and Thailand, Ayub reiterated the request along with a plea for vegetable oil and wheat. Johnson immediately agreed to the food aid and promised to help Pakistan get the tanks from a third party, possibly Turkey. The United States delivered on the food aid, but getting the tanks through third parties proved difficult. The Pakistanis decided to up the ante and served notice on April 6, 1968, for vacating the Badaber intelligence facility upon the expiration of its lease on July 17, 1969. The formal notice of termination did not surprise the Americans. It was the likely way for Pakistan to open negotiations about possibly renewing the lease. But the notice was delivered shortly before the expected arrival in Pakistan of Soviet Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin, a coincidence the Americans found interesting. The Pakistani officials who delivered the notice gave the US ambassador a long speech about how the base disrupted Pakistan's relations with China and the Soviet Union, without bringing any significant benefit to Pakistan. Although the agreement to grant the base to the United States had been kept secret from the Pakistani public, the decision to end the lease was made public even before discussions between the two sides had been completed. Johnson, still confident that his personal ties with Ayub could change things, wrote a personal letter to the Pakistani president seeking continuation of the intelligence facility. The letter said that the Pakistani decision to prematurely announce its position had surprised and disturbed him, and that, too, because of threats and demands by another power. It pointed out that the intelligence facility helped US security, as well as the security of many other nations, and reminded Ayub of the close relationship that has existed for so many years between our two countries. This relationship, Johnson said, had been manifested in America's contribution of more than $3.5 million in aid to Pakistan. He had obviously used the numerals for effect before asking for a reasonable withdrawal period, to lessen the impact of the facility's closure. Johnson ended the letter with the words, "I do not think, old friend, this is too much to ask." Ayub wrote back, and there was some further discussion, including the possibility of giving the Americans some more time in return for the 200 Patton tanks. In the end, however, the Badaber Communications Intercept Facility stopped being operational well before its lease expired. The base was formally handed back on the day of the expiration of its lease. The US alliance with Pakistan, beginning with SEATO, has satisfied neither country. The reason Pakistan accepted the arrangement was obvious to everyone. The country was short of resources, and it had inherited a large military establishment that it sought not only to retain, but also to expand. American critics of the relationship objected more to what journalist Selig Harrison described as the American decision to subsidize Pakistan as a permanent garrison state with a military capability swollen out of all proportion to her size. Chester Bowles, the American ambassador to India, offered a plausible explanation for US decision-making in relation to Pakistan. He attributed American policy towards South Asia as the product of sending important personages to this area who have no knowledge of the forces at work here. Unfamiliar Americans, Bowles said, come convinced that all Asians are inscrutable products of the inscrutable East. But Pakistan's British-trained elite were Asians who argue the advantage of an olive over an onion in a martini, and you know friends they know in London, he argued. This created a mirage for American policymakers. Here, at last, are Asians who make sense, who understand our problems, who face up to the realities, who understand the menace of whatever may worry us at the moment, Bowles observed critically. And so we agree to more F-104s or C-130s, or whatever may be currently required as political therapy to ease wounded Pakistani feelings. Ayub resigned from the presidency in March 1969 after several months of violent demonstrations against his government. Instead of transferring power to the Speaker of the National Assembly, a Bengali, as was required by the constitution he himself had imposed 7 years earlier, Ayub returned the country to martial law. The army chief, General Yahya Khan, became Pakistan's president and chief martial law administrator, ruling by decree and without a constitution. Yahya organized Pakistan's first open elections in December 1970, and these were followed by a brutal civil war in East Pakistan. Chapter 3. A Split and a Tilt. During Richard M. Nixon's successful campaign to become the 37th President of the United States, Pakistan was not mentioned at all. The Vietnam War was the major foreign policy issue during the 1968 elections. But Nixon did feel a strong attachment to Pakistan, so much so that he visited Pakistan within the first few months of his presidency. Pakistan was also his country of choice as the intermediary when opening relations with China. And it was in defense of Pakistan that he described Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi as a bitch and an old witch. Not to be left out, Nixon's national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, likewise made the unusual remark, "The Indians are bastards anyway." These remarks came about in response to Gandhi's visit to Washington in November 1971, at the height of the East Pakistan crisis. At that time, Pakistan's military was forcefully suppressing protests following the country's first election. The Bengali-led Awami League had won the election, but the West Pakistan-based military regime had accused the party of seeking secession with Indian help. After much brutality in East Pakistan, international opinion had aligned against Pakistan. Threat of another India-Pakistan war loomed. Nixon and Kissinger made these remarks during a conversation in the Oval Office that also involved the President's assistant, H.R. Bob Haldeman. The exchange was being recorded for posterity, and its transcript is now available in the Nixon archives. The President had met Gandhi a day earlier and was scheduled to meet her again after his meeting with Kissinger and Haldeman. He was reviewing the previous day's discussion. "I raised my voice a little," Nixon acknowledged. Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, advised him to be a shade cooler today, explaining that even though she was a bitch, we shouldn't overlook the fact that we got what we wanted. The president had warned Gandhi to stay out of West Pakistan, even if Pakistan's military collapsed in East Pakistan, and the message had been conveyed. Kissinger pointed out in such a way that Gandhi could not claim that the United States kicked her in the teeth. A few days later, Nixon and Kissinger spoke again about trying to prevent an Indian attack on West Pakistan. They discussed plans to send an American aircraft carrier into the Bay of Bengal as a deterrent to the Indians. "We're in the position," Kissinger said, "where a Soviet stooge, supported with Soviet arms, is overrunning a country that is an American ally." Kissinger saw this as an opportunity to find out if America could scare a country like India. "If we can still scare somebody else," he said, noting that there was less than a 50-50 chance of that happening, "it may open the Middle East solution." Kissinger was testing America's ability to influence medium-sized powers such as India through bluff. If India could be scared, he seemed to suggest, the much smaller countries of the Middle East could also be forced to comply with US demands without using force. The plan did not work, however, as India calculated correctly that the Americans would not be willing to get into a shooting war. In the same conversation, Nixon expressed irritation over China's refusal to get involved. "Boy, I tell you," he exclaimed, "movement of even some Chinese toward that border could scare those goddamn Indians to death." But by the very next day, the president had tired of working so hard at intervening on Pakistan's behalf. Kissinger informed him that Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev had written a letter proposing negotiations between West and East Pakistan. However, even though mediation could avert bloodshed, Pakistani leaders did not want to be told what to do. Nixon recognized that the partition of Pakistan is a fact and asked, "Now the point is, why then, Henry, are we going through all this agony?" Kissinger replied, "We're going through this agony to prevent the West Pakistan army from being destroyed, because the world's psychological balance of power was at stake. The United States could not allow a Soviet ally to defeat an American ally." In the end, most of Nixon's and Kissinger's exertions proved futile. On December 16, 1971, Indian forces marched triumphantly into Dhaka, the capital of East Pakistan, where Pakistan's army laid down its arms. 90,000 Pakistani troops, civilian officials and allies became prisoners of war. East Pakistan now proclaimed itself the Independent People's Republic of Bangladesh, and it soon received international recognition. After initial hesitation, the United States recognized Bangladesh. But Pakistan refused to recognize Bangladesh for over 2 years, though it eventually relented. Although the United States, with Soviet help, had prevented India from overrunning West Pakistan as well, it received no gratitude for its efforts. The Indians claimed that they had no plans of doing that anyway, whereas the Pakistanis resented the United States for not stepping in to help save the country's eastern wing. The chain of events that led to Pakistan's bifurcation had begun with Ayub's removal from power. Although the United States had lost its intelligence base near Peshawar, some Americans still wanted to retain their alliance with Pakistan, Nixon and Kissinger foremost among them. Their attachment to Pakistan, based on an expectation of support in global strategy, is what had led the United States to support West Pakistan's army. But the tilt brought no advantage to the United States, nor did it serve Pakistan well. American support gave Pakistan a sense of false confidence, which encouraged Pakistani leaders to march into a blunder and then persist with folly. If this had not been the case, Pakistan may have negotiated a settlement with politicians from East Pakistan. But it didn't. The process of Pakistan's breakup had started much earlier than 1971 and was largely a function of domestic politics. Protests broke out against Ayub's government in the fall of 1968, after he had ruled for a decade. Multiple factors contributed to the unrest. Economic growth had stalled after the 1965 war with India. American aid had declined to a third of what it had been, and conditions on loans from the international financial institutions became somewhat stringent. As a result, economic disparities between East and West Pakistan and among different classes had become the subject of political agitation. The people were tired of dictatorship and demanded change. Pakistan's traditional political parties, which Ayub had sidelined, coalesced into an alliance to demand his ouster. The Awami League, AL, led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, referred to as Mujib because of the commonality of his last name, was gaining ground in the East with its calls for greater rights and autonomy for Bengalis. It drew its strength from Bengalis' widespread resentment over being treated as second-class citizens in a country where they constituted the majority of the population. In West Pakistan, Ayub's former foreign minister, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, had formed the Pakistan People's Party, PPP, with a socialist manifesto, and this tapped into his personal popularity. He also benefited from nationalist sentiment generated in the aftermath of the war against India, especially in the Punjab region, from which most of Pakistan's soldiers and civil servants were traditionally recruited. Before the outbreak of the street protests, Mujib had been jailed over allegations that he had conspired with Indian intelligence to pursue East Pakistani secession. Then, soon after violent protests started in both wings of Pakistan, Bhutto was also imprisoned under preventive detention laws. By the time the two were released, both of them had become heroes in their respective parts of the country. Initially, Ayub's administration tried to put the demonstrations down with force. However, Ayub had suffered a stroke, which his subordinates had chosen not to reveal to the public, and by the time he was well enough to start making decisions himself, the situation had spiraled out of control. A CIA assessment noted a steady deterioration of Ayub's political base by February 1969, shortly after Nixon's inauguration. The Pakistani president had previously relied on the military, the civil service, the business community, and the landowners for support, providing an aura of stability after years of political chaos, contributing to Ayub's political longevity. Now, however, widespread rioting had damaged that aura beyond repair. According to the US appraisal, Ayub had justified his highly centralized and at times dictatorial rule by making frequent use of the widespread fear that India will try to reincorporate Pakistan into the Indian Union. This tactic was still one of Ayub's few remaining psychological weapons, but his survival depended solely on the loyalty to the regime of the nation's armed forces. A few days later, another intelligence assessment said that the army did not seem to have the stomach for the violence that would seem necessary to restore order. Pakistan was in for a prolonged period of adjustment, the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research predicted, and the country will be fortunate if it emerges from this period of stress as a single entity. Finally, Ayub resigned on March the 25th, but not until after imposing martial law and handing power over to Army Commander General Yahya Khan. Both men claimed that the military had a legal and constitutional responsibility to defend the country, not only against external aggression, but also from internal disorder and chaos. This transfer of power from one general to another thus amounted to a determination that the Pakistani military was the final arbiter in political matters. The Economist magazine described Ayub's ouster and replacement by Yahya Khan in an editorial titled "Tweedle Khan Takes Over." Most international observers saw Yahya's regime as a continuation of Ayub's. Yahya did not change the foreign and domestic policies that Ayub had pursued for over a decade, and the West Pakistani elite, mostly ethnic Punjabis, continued to dominate the new government as they had the previous one. The chaos that led to Ayub's ouster was related exclusively to Pakistan's internal politics. Although he had been a good friend to the United States until toward the end of his regime, Ayub had erred when he sought domestic strength solely through external relations. He failed to understand his diverse people's aspirations, imposing unity rather than nurturing it by recognizing his nation's differences. Obsessed with his belief in West Pakistan's martial races being superior to the Bengalis, Ayub treated East Pakistan particularly badly. Conversely, Yahya did not follow in Ayub's footsteps by presenting himself as a savior for Pakistan. Instead, he announced his intention to hold elections for an assembly, open to all political parties, that would write a new constitution for the country. He wanted the politicians to maintain the integrity of Pakistan and the glory of Islam, an allusion to the national ideology that had evolved since the days of Liaquat. He also said that he wanted to retire after transferring power to civilians, which blunted opposition that he might otherwise have faced for being Pakistan's second successive military dictator. It would have made sense for the United States to take a step back so Pakistan could resolve its internal discord on its own. But some US policymakers still saw Pakistan solely through the prism of the Cold War. In particular, Kissinger told Nixon that the return to normalcy in Pakistan after Ayub's resignation depended on East Pakistan's accepting martial law. According to Kissinger, violent reaction in East Pakistan to a virtual coup by the West Pakistan establishment, which has long dominated the country, could make the situation in the East Wing dangerous. Although evidence did not suggest that any foreign country played a role in the recent internal disturbances, the National Security Advisor nonetheless concluded that opportunities for foreign meddling, especially by the Communist Chinese, would increase. The Pakistani military also made no effort to pause, reflect, and change the basis of Pakistan's ties with the United States, and deliberated even less over what had caused the country's disharmony. Within days of Yahya's ascent to power, Pakistan's military was pressing the United States to restore military assistance. The Deputy Martial Law Administrator and Commander of the Navy, Vice Admiral Syed Mohammed Ahsan, represented Pakistan at President Eisenhower's funeral in April, using the opportunity to explain to US officials the circumstances of imposing martial law and the new junta's intentions, as well as to plead for renewed military aid. Ahsan told State Department officials that it would be dangerous for the United States to withhold arms from Pakistan, because doing so might force the country to get involved with others who might be inimical to US interests. Pakistan could not afford expensive purchases in Western Europe, Ahsan said, going on to argue that this was a psychologically important time for the United States to invest in Pakistan's new leaders, who needed weapons for internal security and to keep their troops from becoming disgruntled. But the US Embassy in Pakistan was not sure which way the wind was blowing. It asked Washington to weigh the advantages or otherwise of supporting the new government that may or may not win support of the populace and may or may not become a repressive force in order to maintain a strong central government. Although West Pakistanis, especially those from the Punjabi ethnic group, dominated the country, the Bengalis from East Pakistan constituted a majority of Pakistan's population. US diplomats from Dhaka in East Pakistan were already reporting the wide gulf that had opened between the two wings of the country. During this period of major changes in Pakistan, Benjamin Aylert was serving his last few weeks as US ambassador. In a cable to the State Department, he observed that the principal reasons for imposing martial law were to prevent East Pakistan from obtaining national political power proportionate to population. Experience had shown that aid had given Americans considerable access in Pakistan, even if it did not help change the country's policies. Consequently, Aylert proposed supporting Yahya and his military regime to expand leverage of our assistance. In his view, this could help Pakistan by increasing the chances of an American-backed political solution to its internal schism. Secretary of State William Rogers visited Pakistan in May and met Yahya as well as other members of his junta. He was told that martial law had saved Pakistan from chaos, that elections would soon be held, and that a civilian government would come after a constitution was written. Insisting that he was a soldier who would return to soldiering after holding elections, Yahya laid out the case for aid. Pakistan was making economic progress, he said, adding that its economic progress could be cited as vindication of the US philosophy of assistance. When the subject turned to Pakistan's demands for sophisticated weaponry, Yahya argued that Pakistan needed them for its security. But Rogers questioned Pakistan's threat perception and wondered if it was indeed based on reality. He hinted that Pakistan faced problems at home that needed attention. But Yahya seemed more interested in Pakistan's international role, expressing familiar concerns about Afghanistan and India, as well as communist subversion. He assured Rogers that Pakistan had no intention to leave SEATO and CENTO, and that it remained committed to its alliance with the United States. The Nixon White House soon decided that it would resume assistance, including military aid for Pakistan, as soon as it could overcome international and domestic anxieties about doing so. Kissinger told Pakistan's ambassador in Washington, Agha Hilali, that the US president had a very warm spot in his heart for former President Ayub Khan and for Pakistan. He assured the new government that the United States held deep concern for Pakistan's interests and responsiveness to Pakistan's requirements, though he was not sure how that concern might translate into dollars. This heartened Yahya, as did Nixon's decision to visit Pakistan as part of a round-the-world tour that summer. For Nixon, Pakistan was only one stop in an Asia-wide trip. He started his journey on July 23, 1969, by observing the splashdown and recovery of the Apollo 11 spacecraft from the deck of the USS Hornet, followed by an overnight stop in Guam. He traveled to the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and India, and then made an unannounced stopover in South Vietnam before arriving in Pakistan. The American president's journey continued on to Romania, and after a brief stopover in England to meet with Prime Minister Harold Wilson, he returned to the United States on August 3rd. For Yahya, however, Nixon's arrival in Pakistan amounted to receiving the American stamp of approval. He needed it in order to reassure key Pakistani constituencies, especially the army, that the United States would continue paying some of the country's bills, even after Ayub was gone. Thus, Yahya gave Nixon a welcome in Lahore comparable to the one Eisenhower received in Karachi 10 years earlier. While Nixon was there, the Pakistani team made a strong pitch for greater aid. The Pakistani Foreign Secretary even told Nixon that Pakistan's need for a deterrent to India was so critical that it was content with getting weapons that the United States considered obsolete for its own military. Yahya complained that the United States no longer considered Pakistan its most allied ally, a term Eisenhower had used, any longer. "We are still allies," Yahya said, while offering the assurance that Pakistan wanted to move beyond its disagreements with the United States that followed the 1965 war. Nixon agreed that what happened under previous leaders in both countries could now be put behind them. The two countries will be on the up and up with each other, he declared. Nixon's attitude toward Pakistan was influenced, at least in part, by his desire to engage with Communist China. Whereas Kennedy and Johnson had vehemently opposed Pakistan's close ties with Beijing, Nixon hoped to take advantage of them. During the presidential election campaign, Nixon had pointed out that considering its size and significance, China could not be ignored. And as someone with devout anti-communist credentials, he believed he could reach out to China without inviting criticism about being soft on communism. Pakistan, with an equally strong anti-communist reputation, could be a valuable partner in the venture. Since 1955, in the absence of diplomatic relations, China and the United States had interacted through their ambassadors in Warsaw. They had effected little progress except an agreement over repatriation of citizens of the two countries who had been stranded as a result of the communist victory in China in 1949. That agreement was implemented with the help of the British Embassy assisting Americans in Beijing and the Indian Embassy helping the Chinese in Washington. But the Warsaw talks involved the State Department bureaucracy, whereas Nixon envisioned a bold approach, going directly to China's top leaders. He had already sent private signals through US ambassadors in Warsaw and Paris, but these signals did not result in a major breakthrough. The Chinese could not publicly accept that they were doing business with the United States, because even after the communist victory in China's mainland, the Americans still recognized the defeated nationalist Chinese government, limited to the island of Taiwan since 1949, as the legal representative of all of China. The Communist Chinese wanted the United States to recognize their government's legitimacy before open negotiations took place. The Nixon administration had to be mindful of the powerful Taiwan lobby and the strong anti-communist sentiment in the United States. During his round-the-world tour, Nixon brought up China with Yahya, as well as Romanian leader Nicolae Ceausescu. Both dictators had access to Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. If they could verbally convey Nixon's desire for normalizing ties with China, he could possibly put a deal in place before announcing it. A more public negotiating process, such as one involving the US State Department, could result in media leaks and the prospect of the anti-communist sentiment scuttling a deal before it was made. Nixon wanted to present Americans and the Taiwanese government with a fait accompli by announcing an agreement with China rather than opening debate over whether a bargain was desirable. H.R. Haldeman, the US President's chief of staff at the time, recorded in his diary after Nixon's trip that Nixon saw Yahya as a real leader, very intelligent, and with great insight into Russia-China relations. According to Haldeman, Nixon thought that Yahya could be a valuable channel to China and even the Soviet Union. Although Nixon and Kissinger had not yet charted in detail their course for a thaw with China, Nixon's suggestion that Pakistan could act as a bridge between the two superpowers pleased Yahya and other Pakistani officials. After Ayub's decision to end the lease of the Badr Bear intelligence base at Peshawar, which had been meant to show the Americans how much they needed Pakistan, Pakistan's usefulness had diminished in American eyes. Now, however, if Pakistan could be the channel through which the Americans reached China, it would be important again. Acting as the United States intermediary with China could compensate for the loss of influence Pakistan endured when it closed the US intelligence facilities. Soon after Nixon's trip, Yahya started preparing for his new role as facilitator of dialogue between China and the United States. But he did not realize the complexities of US domestic politics, which Nixon and Kissinger had hoped to circumvent. As a result of Yahya's indiscretion, an American diplomat in Pakistan informed the State Department that Yahya was apparently debating whether to communicate Nixon's desire for better relations through the Communist Chinese ambassador, or whether to wait until he sees Zhou Enlai, probably some months hence. Kissinger asked Harold Hal Saunders, a trusted member of his team, to ensure that the discussions over China were treated strictly as a White House matter. The State Department and normal channels of diplomacy were not to be involved. Saunders, a PhD from Yale University, who had served on the National Security Council staff since the Johnson presidency, met with Hilali, the Pakistani ambassador, telling him that Nixon did not have in mind that passing this word was urgent, or that it required any immediate or dramatic Pakistani effort. The US president, Saunders explained, regarded reaching out to China as important, but not as something that needs to be done immediately. Kissinger was to be the sole point of contact on this matter, and the State Department did not need to know, he conveyed. What President Nixon had in mind, Saunders told Hilali, was that President Yahya might at some natural and appropriate time convey this statement of the US position in a low-key factual way. Yahya was scheduled to travel to China at the beginning of 1970, and that would be the appropriate time to convey Nixon's message. Once Kissinger conveyed the need for secrecy as well as the importance of dealing exclusively with the White House, Pakistani officials felt reassured that they had been charged with a major undertaking. Therefore, they immediately asked for some payoff for their country in economic and military assistance, renewing their previous request for planes and tanks. Nixon wanted to help, but could not do so without overcoming congressional skepticism. After Pakistan's 1965 war with India, Congress had passed 2 amendments to the Foreign Assistance Act that forbade arming underdeveloped countries with sophisticated weapons. The Conte-Long Amendment, named after Congressman Silvio Conte, a Republican, and Clarence D. Long, a Democrat, both from Maryland, also required reducing US economic aid to such countries by the amount they used their own resources for such purchases. However, the president could waive this restriction if he determined that a military sale was important to the national security of the US. Another amendment, sponsored by Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri and passed by Congress, directed the president to cut off US economic aid to any developing country that excessively diverted its resources to military expenditures. Congress, therefore, made it known that it did not want the United States arming either India or Pakistan. Consequently, if Nixon wanted to transfer any American weapons to Yahya as a favor, he would have to make a waiver for Pakistan that he would justify on grounds that US national security was at stake. Nixon wanted to provide weapons to Pakistan as a reward for its help in reaching out to China, but he could hardly declare that publicly, especially as at that stage the entire China initiative was being kept secret from the American public. So Kissinger turned to Saunders to find a way out. Saunders, in turn, wrote a detailed memorandum on the options available to the administration, pointing out that America's main interest is in the political and economic evolution of South Asia and not in the development of its military strength. According to Saunders, the political and economic evolution of India and its ability to defend its Himalayan frontier was the greater US priority. Our concern with Pakistan is that its political and economic evolution in the near term be constructive enough not to disrupt India's, he wrote. Saunders was suggesting that the principal US interest in helping Pakistan ought to be to prevent Pakistan from disrupting India, a goal that could not be achieved by enhancing Pakistan's military capabilities. His analysis for the Nixon administration in 1969 differed little from blowtorch Bob Comer's for Johnson in 1965. Similar assessments had also been provided to Presidents Truman and Eisenhower. But any evaluation that Pakistan was less important than India was anathema to Pakistani leaders. So Saunders did not examine the possibility of giving up on Pakistan altogether, though he did wonder whether going back into full-scale military aid would sufficiently further US interests to outweigh the disadvantages, and warned that arming Pakistan again could strengthen the Indian sense of political reliance on the USSR. He then proposed a way out. Pakistan could be given a one-time waiver for some planes and tanks, while conditions should be imposed that assuaged India's concerns. But these recommendations were not good enough for Kissinger. In a handwritten note, he shot back, "Hal, the president wants action, not study. When are the tanks moving? When will the lawyers decide? Please get me quick answers." Once Yahya had conveyed Nixon's message to Zhou Enlai, and the positive Chinese reply had been communicated back, there was even greater urgency to offer Pakistan some recompense. Not surprisingly, the State Department, not fully informed about the China initiative and Pakistan's role in it, fought back. "We do not have overriding political or security interests in South Asia which require us to get back into the arms business," observed Acting Secretary of State Elliot Richardson in a memorandum to the President. Richardson, who resigned as Attorney General a few years later, rather than carry out Nixon's orders during the Watergate controversy, at the time was a rising star in the Nixon administration. And he saw no justification for supplying weapons to any country on the subcontinent. After all, both India and Pakistan had sufficiently strong militaries. The Indians were capable of withstanding a potential Chinese attack, and the prospects of Indo-Pakistan hostilities seemed remote. According to Richardson, India is relatively more important to our interests than Pakistan. Furthermore, he expected that there would be a sharp reaction from India if the United States changed its policy and resumed supplying weapons to Pakistan. "If we can please only one of the two countries, we should lean toward India, the larger and more influential power," he declared unequivocally. "Pakistan's unhappiness will be containable. It will continue to maintain good relations with us as a political offset to its relations with the USSR and Communist China, and because we are Pakistan's largest aid donor." The State Department also recommended to maintain the status quo and retain the arms embargo for South Asia. But Richardson realized that Nixon felt some obligation to President Yahya that might take the form of providing some military equipment or some economic development-related help. He expressed the hope that any gesture toward Pakistan would not mark a significant departure from existing policy. In response, the State Department recommended a one-time exception to the embargo and supported the sale of 6 F-104 fighter aircraft to Pakistan, planes that Pakistan had asked to purchase. Kissinger asked officials at the State Department to review their recommendation. He told Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs, Joseph Sisko, that Nixon feels morally obligated to do something for Yahya. Kissinger then proposed that the United States offer a military aid package to Pakistan that included 7 B-57 bombers and the tanks that Pakistan had been requesting for some time. Sisko informed Kissinger that those additions would make a defensive replacement package seem more offensive and would have more effect in India. He felt that adding 6 B-57s could be justified as a replacement of old planes, but more tanks would have an unfortunate psychological effect. After bargaining with the State Department on behalf of the Pakistani military, Kissinger explained, "Our worry is that this package is so small they will consider it an insult." Although willing to offer more weapons to Pakistan in discharging what Nixon considered a moral obligation, the White House was not completely ignorant of the views of Pakistan's generals. Kissinger had learned firsthand during a conversation with the West Pakistan governor, Air Marshal Nur Khan, that Pakistan was ready to stumble into another war as it had done earlier. Nur Khan, known for his intellect and professional competence, came from a district in Punjab that was home to many of Pakistan's military men. He had been the chief of the Air Force and was a quintessential member of Pakistan's establishment. In their meeting in Lahore in August 1969, Nur Khan had told Kissinger that Pakistan realized it could not take Kashmir by force, but there was no reason for Pakistan to cease its support for Kashmiris, which, according to Nur Khan, was now limited to propaganda. The Air Marshal said he could see why the United States and the other great powers would want the Kashmir problem to be settled, but he could see no reason why Pakistan would benefit from such a settlement. Nur Khan offered a succinct explanation of Pakistan's strategic vision. "In the present situation, Pakistan obviously is not going to get what it wanted," he said to Kissinger, "as a settlement would require appeasement of India, which in turn would formally declare Pakistan's second-class status in the subcontinent. Consequently, waiting for an opportunity to arise that would force India's hand in Kashmir while increasing its own military preparedness would serve Pakistan better." Nur Khan also made it clear that Pakistan needed additional US aircraft to maintain its military balance with India. He effectively told Kissinger that Pakistan was in a permanent state of war with India over Kashmir and had no interest in resolving the conflict through talks. Pakistan did not want to be seen as less important or less powerful than India. Equal status with India took priority over solving specific issues such as Kashmir. In Kissinger's mind, Pakistan's readiness to go to war again with India was not enough to deter him and Nixon from resuming arms supplies to Pakistan. Yahya's value as an ally lay in creating an opening for US ties with China, and that mattered more, as did the need to outmaneuver the Soviet Union in South Asia. Although neither India nor Pakistan were likely to go communist anytime soon, Nixon's team constantly thought about the need to deny the Soviets influence in Pakistan. Thus, when Yahya scheduled a visit to Moscow in June 1970, Kissinger rushed to convey to him Nixon's willingness to sell a substantial amount of military hardware that Pakistan had requested. Pakistan would now be able to get a 12-aircraft squadron of tactical fighter aircraft, F-104Gs or F-5s, or 6 replacement 104As. Kissinger explained that their intent was to enable Pakistan to reactivate its F-104A squadron, either by replacing planes lost and bringing it up to strength, or by trading in the old planes and re-establishing the squadron with new aircraft. In addition, 300 armoured personnel carriers and 4 advanced design naval patrol anti-submarine aircraft would be supplied. 7 B-57 bombers would replace B-57 aircraft the United States had previously supplied, but had been lost through attrition. Kissinger told Hilali that the president wanted President Yahya to know that this had been done on the basis of his personal intervention and personal interest. Hilali noted the word sell and asked whether credit could be discussed. Pakistan simply did not have the money to buy the equipment, but Kissinger's team had been working on the assumption of a cash sale. Given the congressional opposition as well as restrictions imposed by the Foreign Military Sales Act, offering credit to Pakistan would be difficult. If Kissinger had expected appreciation from Pakistan, none was forthcoming. Hilali pointed out that there were no tanks on the list. Kissinger explained that the White House had tried to introduce tanks into the package, but realized that this could wreck the whole arrangement. The furore that might have arisen in Congress could have produced further amendments to the Foreign Military Sales Act or the later appropriations legislation, making any kind of arrangement impossible. According to Kissinger, it was important to first establish the principle that the United States will continue to supply military equipment to Pakistan before moving forward. Yahya's response was somewhat better than Hilali's. Joseph Farland, a lawyer who had arrived in Pakistan as US ambassador soon after Yahya's coup, informed the Pakistani president of the decision. Farland, a West Virginia Republican who owned a coal mining company, had previously served as ambassador in the Dominican Republic and Panama, and had a reputation for pursuing unconventional methods of diplomacy. In Pakistan, this had translated into regular informal meetings with key public figures, including Yahya and his inner circle. Yahya immediately exclaimed that he was deeply pleased and appreciative of the president's action, Farland reported to the State Department. Yahya said the president's decision is not only a gesture of friendship, but also evidence that the US understands Pakistan's problems and difficulties, he continued. But the idea of cash sales did not cheer the Pakistani president. Pakistan is broke, and everyone knows it, he told Farland, adding that the United States knew that better than anyone else. According to Farland, Yahya said he valued above all the friendship and support which President Nixon's decision evidenced. He did not want to get into a detailed discussion of the package that had been offered, but the Pakistan army badly needed to replenish its tank inventory and would have to continue to seek supplies. Yahya left me in no doubt, Farland summarized, that he was sorry we had been unable to accommodate Pakistan on tanks, to which they obviously attached great importance. Subsequently, the Pakistani leader explored ways to get around the cash payment framework. Yahya asked Farland about the possibility of substantial concessions on prices and concessions on timing of payments. He said that he and his government would face a very difficult situation if Pakistan was unable to pay for US equipment that it required and desired, and that the Americans had offered to sell. The deal was, for Pakistanis, as much a matter of national prestige as a question of securing equipment for their armed forces. Nixon and Yahya got a chance to speak directly when Yahya visited the United States for the 25th anniversary celebrations of the United Nations. Each president had one major issue on his mind. Nixon was uneasy about the slow pace of his outreach to China, and Yahya was troubled by the difficulty in procuring American arms, which he needed in order to retain the Pakistani military's respect, even more than to confront India. Kissinger took notes of their meeting in the Oval Office. Yahya is tough, direct, and with a good sense of humour, observed Kissinger. He talks in a very clipped way, is a splendid product of Sandhurst, and affects a sort of social naivety, but is probably much more complicated than this. That apparently made it easier for Nixon to treat Yahya as a personal friend instead of approaching him as the head of state of an ally that had drifted away. The US president began the conversation by blaming congressional opposition for difficult times in our relationships with our allies, and assuring Yahya that we will stick by our friends. Nixon said, "There is a psychosis in this country about India," before promising that, "We will keep our word with Pakistan." Nixon's comments about India animated Yahya, as did the words, "We will work with you, and we will try to be as helpful as we can." Yahya said, somewhat poetically, "We were surrounded by enemies when we became friends. We are no longer surrounded by enemies, but we will still remain friends." Neither leader addressed directly the objections that most Americans raised about military supplies to Pakistan. But Yahya wanted Nixon to know that he would not strengthen the American president's congressional critics by simultaneously seeking weapons from the Soviet Union. If Pakistan really felt threatened by India and needed weapons for its defense, closing other options for acquiring them would not make sense. "We are a sentimental people, and we will never do anything to embarrass you," Yahya declared, meaning that Nixon's gesture of support had earned him personal goodwill in Pakistan. Nixon responded, "Your people are too proud to do a thing like that," appreciating that Pakistan chose being an American ally over the non-alignment India had adopted. But then Yahya set aside his pride and added, after expressing approval for the recent military assistance package, an additional request for economic aid. The Aid to Pakistan Consortium, organized by the World Bank, was scheduled to meet in the near future, he explained. The Japanese Prime Minister, Isako Sato, had apparently told Yahya that the amount of Japanese aid to Pakistan would depend on whether the United States would agree to a significant contribution. Nixon then turned to Kissinger and, according to Kissinger, ordered me to do what I could to encourage assistance to Pakistan. The Pakistani president also updated Nixon on Pakistani domestic politics. General elections were scheduled for December the 7th, he said, adding a swipe at Bhutto for accusing Yahya of waiting to cut a deal with India and selling out Pakistan. It was absurd the levels to which political opponents would stoop, Kissinger reported Yahya as saying. In response, Nixon proposed a strong presidency, as in France, for Pakistan. Yahya said, "Without it, Pakistan would disintegrate. Our people like the parliamentary system only because they have been ruled by Britain for so many centuries. But they cannot make it work, and they do not have the basic prerequisite, namely a two-party system. We have about 35 parties." Once he felt that Yahya was sufficiently confident of US support, Nixon gave him his assignment, beginning with the words, "I understand you are going to Peking." Nixon then declared, "It is essential that we open negotiations with China." He wanted Yahya to tell Zhou Enlai that the United States would not close ranks with the Soviet Union against China, now that the Sino-Soviet rift was widening, and that the United States was also willing to send a high-level emissary to Peking to establish links secretly. Yahya said he had been told to establish secret links before and had communicated it to the Chinese. The Chinese had asked whether the United States was thinking of a hotline to Peking, similar to the one that existed to Moscow. Nixon categorically told Yahya that was not what he meant. The United States was willing to send ambassadors. The significance of the message was not lost on Yahya. Until now, Yahya was conveying to the Chinese Nixon's desire for good relations, but now he could play an even more substantive role by providing cover for secret links involving a high-level emissary. On December the 7th, 1970, Pakistan held its first general elections since its independence in 1947. With dozens of political parties in the fray, Yahya and his fellow generals had hoped for a fragmented result. The military had even worked behind the scenes to ensure that the Constituent Assembly is so fragmented as to render impossible the drafting of a constitution. Further, the military regime had tried to safeguard Pakistan's identity as an Islamic ideological state before allowing the people to vote. Propaganda through state-controlled media and changes in academic curriculum would forestall elected politicians' attempts to alter Pakistan's orientation fundamentally. Official media had projected the year-long election campaign, which officially began on January the 1st, as a battle between Islam and socialism. As a result, Islamist vigilantes violently confronted their secular rivals on university campuses and in trade unions. Yahya's Minister for Information, Major General Sher Ali Khan, used a journalist strike in April-May as an excuse to purge state and privately owned media of leftists and secularists. Cadres from the Islamist party, Jamaat-e-Islami, then replaced the purged journalists. The well-funded Islamists confronted Bhutto's PPP in West Pakistan and the Awami League in the Eastern Wing. Judging by their visibility in the media, the Islamists appeared quite powerful. Their attacks on the PPP focused on the un-Islamic lifestyle of the party's popular leader and stooped so low as to allege that Bhutto's mother had been a Hindu. Further, the Awami League was accused of close ties with Bengali Hindus and was alleged to be funded by India. But the ideological debates that Pakistan's military orchestrated attracted attention only in garrison towns and from religiously conservative urban intellectuals. For the rural masses, bread and butter issues were more important. Here, the Awami League's promise of greater power for impoverished Bengalis and Bhutto's calls for income redistribution had tremendous advantage. The Awami League got a further boost when a major cyclone followed by a tidal wave struck East Pakistan on November the 12th, less than a month before the election. Images of impoverished Bengalis uprooted from their homes in coastal areas served as a reminder of West Pakistan's neglect of the Eastern Wing. The US government worried about the tragedy's effect on Yahya's position, as Pakistan's government lacked the capacity to manage the situation. But Nixon worried that publicly giving too much aid or help may embarrass Yahya. For rescue operations, the United States provided 6 helicopters and 50 16-foot motor launches, each with a carrying capacity of 2 tons, and $50 million in aid under various heads. Pakistan's request for 50,000 tons of wheat was also immediately approved, though the staple food in East Pakistan was rice. Kissinger told Nixon that the United States had to maintain a subtle posture in providing disaster relief for political reasons as well as humanitarian ones. The East-West issue within Pakistan is an extremely delicate one for President Yahya, especially in this election period, he explained. A highly visible appearance that the US was injecting its independent management would carry the implication that President Yahya's government in West Pakistan could not or would not effectively manage this situation in East Pakistan. But the impression the US government sought to eschew could not be avoided. Bengalis concluded that they could not trust West Pakistani leaders or their Bengali cohorts any longer. On election day, they overwhelmingly voted for the Awami League. When the votes were counted, Yahya's regime's expectations of a truncated parliament were not fulfilled. The Awami League had won more than 72% of the popular vote in East Pakistan and ended up with 160 seats out of the 300 contested seats. Its uncontested winning of 7 seats reserved for women gave it a total of 167 seats in the 313-member National Assembly. Only 2 National Assembly seats from East Pakistan went to non-Awami League members. In the provincial assembly election 10 days later, the Awami League secured 89% of the votes and won 288 out of 300 seats in East Pakistan. In West Pakistan, Bhutto's Pakistan People's Party, PPP, won 81 out of 138 seats for the National Assembly, mainly in the provinces of Sindh and Punjab, and the addition of 4 seats reserved for women would take its tally up to 85. Its share of the popular vote, however, was 38.89%. Baluchistan and the Northwest Frontier Province, since renamed Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, gave a plurality to the Pashtun nationalist National Awami Party, NAP. The Orthodox Jamiat Ulema Islam, JUI, which had aligned itself with the left-wing parties instead of other Islamists, came in second in those 2 provinces. The conservative parties that the military covertly supported had fared poorly. The election results meant that Yahya and the military would not have a smooth ride when steering the country toward a constitution of their choice. Yahya had agreed with Nixon that Pakistan needed the steadying hand of a strong president. As he had told Nixon, he was skeptical about parliamentary democracy in a country with 35 parties, because, he claimed, parliamentary democracy worked best in a 2-party system. Although Pakistan now had 2 major parties, That did not augur well for Yahya or the military's vision for the country, as neither of the two major parties were likely to yield their mandate to a strong presidency. The Americans were also not happy with the outcome. They had neither predicted nor prepared for it, and now they had to deal with a complex political situation. Even if Yahya remained in charge, he could not ignore Mujib and Bhutto, who had emerged as popular leaders of Pakistan's two wings. The State Department's Director of Intelligence and Research, Ray Klein, interpreted the election results for the US government the very next day in a report titled, "Pakistan, Election Results Suggest Fresh Problems." The Awami League's sweep, which may give it an absolute majority in the forthcoming Constituent Assembly, Klein's report said, and the surprising victory of the PPP have called into question almost all of the speculations about the post-election period which preceded December the 7th. These speculations have projected a combination between the Awami League and West Pakistani centrists, which might have resulted in needed accommodation between Pakistan's two wings on the key issue of provincial autonomy. But the prospect of accommodation had become more problematic. The Awami League would now be tempted to press for more autonomy than the West Pakistanis are prepared to accept, Klein cautioned. Even if Mujib understood the dangers of asking for too much, he might not be able to restrain his followers. The emergence of Bhutto as a figure of substantial prominence had also complicated the situation. According to Klein's assessment, Bhutto's radical appeals were anathema to the present establishment, and thus may raise fresh doubts in the minds of the regime as to the value of popular government. Although Bhutto had avoided open criticism of the Awami League's demands for autonomy, Klein thought that his proclivities reflected preference for a strong centre. Bhutto was unlikely to join forces with Sheikh Mujib on the issue of autonomy, but that would make Yahya the key to resolving any critical questions. Yahya knew he would have to work with Mujib, Klein explained, but he had supposed that the present West Pakistani ruling elite would be well represented in the new legislature. Now, however, there were very few centrists who could work with and control the Awami League leader and thus protect West Pakistani interests. Before holding elections, Yahya had insisted that the new Constituent Assembly must complete its work on a constitution within 120 days, and that Yahya would have to approve the proposed constitution. Given the election results, Klein presciently observed that ending martial law and establishing a popular civilian government had become less certain. Further, he anticipated dire consequences if the future constitution did not include the Awami League's vision of adequate autonomy. The Bengali reaction could well be secession, he warned. Klein also spoke of the election's foreign affairs implications. Both the PPP and the Awami League favoured balancing relations with the United States, the USSR, and China. Both also called for Pakistan's withdrawal from SEATO and CENTO. Bhutto, however, has made much of Pakistan's relations with China, wrote the CIA veteran, adding, "There is every reason to conclude that private disclaimers to the contrary notwithstanding, he would favour China at the expense of the United States." He also noted that Mujib's and Bhutto's views diverged significantly in relation to the subcontinent. The Awami League leader favoured decreasing tension and resuming trade with India. But in Klein's assessment, Bhutto, reflecting both his own xenophobia and popular West Pakistani sentiment, including that of the military, urges a hard line toward India, frequently couched in inflammatory and irresponsible language. With all this in mind, American diplomats watched cautiously as Bhutto and Mujib started negotiating the new constitution. These negotiations dragged on for almost 2 months and remained inconclusive. In February 1971, Yahya belatedly scheduled a session of the Constituent Assembly for March the 3rd in Dhaka, the capital of East Pakistan, but later postponed it indefinitely, ostensibly on Bhutto's demand. The West Pakistani leader saw no point in attending the assembly meeting until his party in the Awami League had agreed on the basic principles of the constitution. Bhutto and Yahya had most likely acted in concert, because no one in relatively privileged West Pakistan was prepared to cede power completely to the Bengali majority. Kissinger foresaw the fresh crisis emerging in Pakistan and told Nixon that it could have far-reaching implications for US interests in South Asia. He recognized that the main issue was the power relationship between East and West Pakistan, and he lamented that Mujib and Bhutto had failed to forge a consensus. But he saw the issue primarily from Yahya's perspective. Yahya remains committed to turning his military government over to the civilian politicians, Kissinger wrote, adding that Yahya was not willing to preside over the splitting of Pakistan. The odds were increasing against the emergence of a constitutional acceptable to each of the major parties, Mujib, Bhutto and Yahya. Mujib was planning to stick with his demands for the virtual autonomy of East Pakistan, and if he does not get his way, which is very likely, to declare East Pakistan's independence. The Bengali leader had approached US and other diplomats to play a peacemaking role to avoid an East-West civil war if he does not get his way and makes a unilateral declaration of independence. The United States was being forced to walk a very narrow tightrope. Kissinger noted that although the United States was not the controlling factor in the emerging situation, all major actors in Pakistan's unfolding drama were seeking its influence. We do have some important interests, and our posture at this juncture is critical to how these interests will be protected in the future, he pointed out. The US position had been to support the unity of Pakistan, as the United States had been forced to state that position in response to some Pakistani politicians' charges that the United States was plotting East Pakistani secession. Kissinger wanted Nixon to determine American policy when faced with the declaration of East Pakistani independence. He wondered whether the United States should adopt a more neutral stance toward Mujib, who was basically friendly toward the US. This would hedge against the day the United States might have to deal with an independent East Pakistan. The National Security Advisor realized that there is very little material left in the fabric of the unity of Pakistan. But that reality was inconvenient because, in his view, the division of Pakistan would not serve US interests. He wanted to start contingency planning in order to protect US interests in the face of the growing possibility that East and West Pakistan would split. The worst-case scenario for the United States could be the emergence of two countries out of Pakistan, both opposing American interests. India was already closer to the Soviet Union than to the United States. The loss of Pakistan would mean that the Americans had lost all of South Asia. While Kissinger sought Nixon's direction for dealing with the changing circumstances in East Pakistan, Ambassador Farland travelled to Dhaka and met Mujib. The Awami League leader was unwilling to join Yahya and his cronies in blaming Bhutto exclusively for the delay in convening the newly elected parliament. Instead, he held the army responsible for trying to manipulate the situation to stay in power. Those very people who had supported Ayub, he told Farland, had brought about the current situation. According to Mujib, Bhutto's hard line toward East Pakistan was the result of the help and leadership of certain West Pakistani military officers. Bhutto favoured excessive expenditures on military preparedness, precisely because of his ties to a section of the Pakistani military. He predicted that the life struggle of Bangladesh would begin when Bhutto called off all talks, and the Constituent Assembly failed to meet because Yahya refused to summon it. During his meeting with the US ambassador, Mujib made it clear that the eclipse of West Pakistani military leadership would not threaten US interests. He also denigrated Bhutto's love for communist China and his intransigent position vis-à-vis India, Farland reported. Mujib reflected at length upon his anti-communist position and the dangers that China portended to the area. But what distinguished Mujib from West Pakistanis who had dealt with the United States since Pakistan's independence was his attitude toward India. He declared that Bangladesh needed to re-establish good relations with India and reopen the historic trade routes in the area. Mujib said he did not want separation. Instead, he wanted a form of confederation in which the people of Bangladesh would get their just and rightful share of foreign aid, and not a mere 20%. Products from Bangladesh constituted the main source of hard currency earnings for Pakistan, he argued, prompting him to ask, rhetorically, How can Islamabad justify the crumbs which they have thrown us? In effect, the Bengali leader was asking the United States to use its influence to redress West Pakistan's injustices against his people. His electoral mandate gave him the right to seek a constitutional arrangement his voters preferred. Mujib also wanted Americans to know that their past policy of supporting the West Pakistan Army and its leaders had not turned him and the Bengali people against the United States. All Washington needed to do was take off its blinders and stop assuming that only through close ties with West Pakistani generals could American interests be protected. Previously, American policymakers, beginning with Dulles, had looked at Pakistan only through the eyes of its fighting men. But now they were confronted with Pakistan's internal contradictions that journalists and academics like Margaret Bourke-White and Hans J. Morgenthau had pointed out, only to be ignored. The subcontinent was on the verge of another partition, this time not on the basis of religion, but on grounds of ethnicity. As an independent country, Bangladesh would be more ethnically homogeneous than either India or Pakistan. One language, a common culture, and a shared history would unite it. Islam would be the religion of Bangladesh's majority, but unlike Pakistan, it would not be the basis of its nationhood. Regrettably, few Americans in government had paid attention to the Bengali perspective while allying with Pakistan's military leaders. Most of Pakistan's generals belonged to the West Pakistani provinces of Punjab and the northwest frontier. They were ethnic Punjabis or Pashtuns. Some were from the Urdu-speaking minority that moved to Pakistan from northern India after partition. Pakistan's army was a product of the British concept of martial races, which had led the British in India to recruit soldiers only from certain ethnic groups. The British had not deemed the Bengalis a martial race, so Pakistan's army boasted very little East Pakistani representation. In 1947, Bengalis constituted only 1% of the Pakistan army, and by the 1960s, the number went up to only 7%. In the officer corps, the difference was sharper. Similarly, Pakistan's bureaucracy had far fewer Bengalis than it had West Pakistanis. In 1966, only 27,648 government officials, out of a total of 114,302, belonged to East Pakistan. Although East Pakistan was the country's major foreign exchange earner, it received a smaller share of federal investment. As a result, in 1970, West Pakistani per capita income was 61% higher than Bengali per capita income. East Pakistan had been seething with anger long before Mujib and the Awami League translated that rage into votes. But West Pakistani officers were unable to feel the depth of this sentiment in what can only be described as colonial hubris. The West Pakistani elite seemed willing to risk the division of the country rather than allow the Bengali majority to have a leading role in the country's governance. Successive Pakistani leaders had tried to forge Pakistani nationhood on the basis of Islam and hatred of India, but the Bengalis resented the West Pakistani tendency to see their cultural affinity with Bengali Hindus as somehow un-Islamic. After all, their economic interests were more closely tied to India. With American assistance, West Pakistan had achieved a degree of industrialization, which enabled West Pakistan to export cotton yarn and textiles to Europe, the United States, and Japan. Thus, East Pakistanis still preferred traditional trade patterns that had linked India, through Bengal, to Southeast Asia.